The bunker smelled like burnt metal and fear. I had stopped counting the hours 2 days ago. The display on my wrist panel still worked, technically, but looking at it only made the weight heavier. 97 hours. That was how long the Keth had been reducing my world to rubble, dome by dome, district by district, with the cold patience of a people who had never once lost a war. My name is Velthara. I am the senior ambassador of the Korathi Conclave. I have spent 40 years of my life building bridges between civilizations, filing reports, attending summits, shaking hands that had too many fingers or too few. I believed, genuinely believed, that the Galactic Assembly was something worth believing in. I do not believe that anymore. The bunker was deep beneath what used to be the diplomatic quarter of Korathi Prime's capital. The walls were original stone, 3 meters thick, designed to survive a tectonic event. They were doing their job. Outside, nothing was doing its job. The air recyclers were working at 60%. The emergency lighting buzzed and flickered every few minutes. Lieutenant Ovas, my aide, sat in the corner with a portable comm unit on his lap, listening to static, because listening to static was better than listening to the strikes. We had sent the first distress signal 17 days ago. Not a small signal, not a quiet, polite request for consultation. A full-spectrum emergency broadcast on every registered frequency in the Galactic Assembly's communication network, stamped with the Korathi Conclave's highest diplomatic seal, marked urgent in 43 recognized languages, including the 3 that the Keth themselves used. Within 6 hours, we had received acknowledgement from the Assembly's administrative office on Varath Station. They had received our signal. They were convening an emergency session. We should await their response. We awaited. On day 3, the Keth took out our outer orbital stations. They did it quietly, efficiently, the way someone tidies a room before important guests arrive. On day 5, the Assembly sent word that the session had been postponed due to a procedural disagreement over the language of the agenda. I read that message 4 times. I thought I had misunderstood it. I had not. On day 9, the Keth began striking the surface. Not the military installations first. Those came later. They started with the power relays, the water processing facilities, the atmospheric recyclers in the outer domes. They were not trying to destroy us quickly. They were trying to make us understand slowly how completely they controlled whether we continued to breathe. On day 12, the Assembly voted. I received the result in a single paragraph. The Galactic Assembly, having deliberated in good conscience and considered the full complexity of the situation, was unable to authorize military intervention at this time, as unanimous consent had not been reached among the member species. The Assembly expressed its deep concern for the Korathi people and pledged to continue monitoring the situation. It encouraged all parties to seek a diplomatic resolution. I sat with that message for a long time. The Keth do not seek diplomatic resolutions. The Keth have a philosophical framework, ancient and rigid, which holds that any species which cannot defend itself has, by that failure, surrendered its right to exist. This is not a fringe belief among them. It is not the view of an extreme faction. It is the foundational principle of their entire civilization, encoded in their oldest texts, taught to their children before they learn arithmetic. They are not cruel by our standards. They do not enjoy suffering. They simply believe with total sincerity that they are performing a service for the galaxy by removing what does not deserve to remain. In 400 years of recorded interstellar history, no one had stopped them. The Assembly's non-intervention vote had not been unanimous, which meant at least one member had voted in favor of helping us. I learned later that several had voted against action for reasons that were almost impressive in their transparency. The Chiluvari cited distance. Their home systems were 20 light-years from the nearest Keth expansion zone, and they preferred to remain interested observers. The Ven Collective had extensive trade agreements with the Keth and abstained from voting at all, which the Assembly's rules treated as a neutral position. The Sarathi had simply said no, in a statement so brief it barely qualified as a position, because the Sarathi had watched the Keth absorb 3 civilizations in the past century, and had drawn the only conclusion they felt was rational. And the humans. Humanity had abstained. I had thought about that more than I should have, in the dark hours of the bunker when Ovas was asleep, and the static from the comm unit was the only sound. I had met human diplomats before. They were peculiar people, warm in a way that felt almost excessive, quick to laugh, quick to anger, with a habit of speaking as if every conversation was the most important one they had ever had. Their representative at the Assembly, a man named Caleb Ford, had shaken my hand at the vote announcement and looked genuinely sorry. He had said something I did not fully understand at the time. He had said, "An abstention is not the same as a no." I had thanked him politely and gone back to waiting. That was 5 days ago. Now Ovas was standing over me with the look on his face that he got when he had information he did not want to deliver. "Ambassador," he said, "tell me." Long-range sensors just picked up a contact. It entered the system approximately 40 minutes ago. He paused. "It has been decelerating." I looked up at him. "A ship?" "Yes, mass profile consistent with a vessel approximately 1,200 meters in length." He checked the display on his wrist. The entry velocity, Ambassador, whatever it was moving at before it began decelerating, our sensors cannot calculate it accurately. The deceleration curve suggests it has been shedding velocity for 40 minutes, and it is still moving faster than anything we have on record for a ship that size. I stood up, my knees hurt, everything hurt. "Whose transponder?" Ovas looked at the display again. He looked at it for a long time. "No transponder signal," he said, "but it is broadcasting on an open channel." He held the unit toward me so I could hear. The voice was calm, female, human, it said. "This is the Relentless Consequence United Human Stellar Ship operating under Emergency Authorization Directive 7. To all Keth forces in the Korathi system, you have 13 minutes to begin withdrawal. This is your only warning. We will not repeat it." The static returned. I stood in the flickering light of the bunker, with the smell of burnt metal in my lungs and 97 hours of siege pressing down on every surface of my body, and I listened to that static for a very long time. One ship. They had sent one ship. I did not know whether to feel hope or a deeper kind of despair. I did not know what Directive 7 was. I did not know who was on that vessel or what it was carrying. I did not know if one human ship, alone, in a system controlled by 34 Keth warships and hundreds of thousands of ground forces, could do anything at all except die loudly. But I knew this. They came. When every other voice in the galaxy had gone quiet, when the Assembly had filed its concerns and pledged its monitoring and expressed its deep regret, when the static on Ovas' comm unit had stretched from hours into days, something had come howling out of the dark at a speed that should not have been possible. Ovas was looking at me. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "what do we do?" I sat back down. I folded my hands. I made myself breathe. "We hold," I said. "We hold a little longer." Fleet Admiral Jarath of the Keth Dominion did not consider himself a cruel being. This distinction mattered to him. He had served in the Dominion's expansion fleet for 31 years. He had overseen the neutralization of 4 civilizations, each of which had, in his assessment, been given every reasonable opportunity to demonstrate the qualities that would have justified their continued existence. They had failed to do so. The Keth had proceeded accordingly. Jarath had filed his after-action reports with the same precise language each time, and he had slept without difficulty. He was not a monster, he was a professional. He stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Voreth's Edge, and watched the siege of Korathi Prime with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has planned something well and is watching it unfold correctly. The Korathi were a soft species, intelligent, diplomatic, built for conversation rather than conflict. They had no meaningful military. They had their assembly and their ambassadors, and their carefully maintained relationships with species that had, ultimately, decided they were not worth the cost of saving. This was the natural order. Jareth had no personal animosity toward the Korathi. They had simply failed the test, as so many others had before them. The Keth would take what they needed from Korathi Prime, document what was worth documenting, and add this system to the Dominion's territory. In 3 generations, no one would remember the Korathi as anything other than a footnote. Admiral, his senior tactical officer, a young male named HFY, turned from his station with a carefully neutral expression. Long-range contact, single vessel entering the system on a deceleration approach. Classification: unknown. Mass profile is significant, approximately 1,200 meters. No transponder registration in our database. HFY paused. The deceleration curve is unusual, Admiral. Our systems cannot establish a reliable entry velocity. Whatever it was moving at before deceleration began, it exceeds our sensor calibration range. Jareth turned from the viewport. A refugee convoy. No, Admiral. Single mass signature, 1 vessel. Jareth considered this briefly. A single vessel. 1,200 meters was not a small ship, but it was not large enough to matter in any practical sense, given what he had arrayed in this system. 34 ships of the line, 6 support vessels, and complete orbital dominance. Whatever was approaching was either very brave or very poorly informed about the situation it was flying into. Open a targeting solution, he said. Passive track. I want to know what we are dealing with before we act. Yes, Admiral. The Vorath's edge was 3 kilometers long and carried enough weapons to reduce a city in a single sustained strike. It had never been seriously threatened in combat. Jareth could not immediately imagine a circumstance in which one incoming ship would constitute a threat that required anything more than a standard intercept response. But he was a thorough man, and thoroughness had kept him alive and successful for 3 decades. His communications officer, a quiet female named Verath, whose efficiency Jareth had long appreciated, turned from her station with a slight change in her expression. Not alarm, something closer to uncertainty. Admiral, the contact is broadcasting. Open channel, all frequencies. Play it. The voice that came through the deck speakers was calm and unhurried. Female. The accent was human. Jareth had dealt with human diplomats twice in his career and recognized the particular rhythm of their speech, that quality they had of sounding like they were speaking the most reasonable words possible, even when the content was completely unreasonable. This is the Relentless Consequence, United Human Stellar Ship, operating under Emergency Authorization Directive 7. To all Keth forces in the Korathi system, you have 13 minutes to begin withdrawal. This is your only warning. We will not repeat it. The message ended. Jareth looked at it for a moment, the way one might look at a small animal that has placed itself in the center of a road and refused to move. Then he laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not mocking, not theatrical. He actually found it funny. One human ship, alone, in a system he controlled absolutely, transmitting withdrawal demands and attaching a time limit to them. There was something almost admirable about the absurdity of it. Compose a response, he said. Standard channel. Tell them your bravery is noted. Your sacrifice will be equally noted. He thought for a moment. Leave the rest unsaid. They'll understand. Yes, Admiral. Jareth turned back to the viewport and watched the distant burn of the approaching vessel's drive signature. The humans were, as a species, an interesting case. They had been in interstellar space for only a little over 2 centuries, young by galactic standards, energetic, somewhat chaotic. They had a reputation for unpredictability, but Jareth had never found that reputation credible on examination. Every species was predictable if you understood their motivations. The humans were motivated by sentiment, by emotional attachment to abstract principles. They called it values. It made them inconsistent diplomats and, in Jareth's estimation, marginal threats. One ship. He watched his tactical officer finish the targeting solution and felt the comfortable certainty of a man holding every card in the deck. Then the numbers came in on the hull temperature of the approaching vessel. Jareth looked at the display. He looked at it again. The contact was not just warm from its deceleration burn. It was extraordinarily hot, the kind of heat signature that came from a ship that had been pushing its drive systems beyond their rated tolerance for a sustained and extended period. Not hours, days. "How long has this vessel been traveling at that level of output?" he asked. Atrath worked his station. "Based on the thermal profile and the projected entry velocity, our best estimate is 19 to 20 days of sustained emergency-level drive use." Jareth said nothing for a moment. 19 days. The assembly vote on Korathi had been 17 days ago. The Keth had been in this system for 97 hours, which meant this ship had not waited for the assembly's decision. It had not waited for permission. It had begun moving before any official process had concluded, not in response to a decision, but in anticipation of a failure. Someone had looked at the situation, calculated that the assembly would not act in time, and lit their drive before the vote even happened. "What do we know about Directive 7? He asked. Verath answered without hesitation. She had already been looking it up. It is a provision in the Human Stellar Navy Charter. It authorizes unilateral intervention by a senior commanding officer without assembly approval in documented cases of ongoing mass atrocity where the assembly has failed to act within 72 hours. It has been invoked twice previously in human naval history. Jareth was quiet for a moment. So one human captain, acting alone, decided to come here. That appears to be correct, Admiral. One captain. Alone. 19 days of burning across the dark, without permission, without support, without any certainty that her ship would survive what it found at the end of the journey. Jareth turned this fact over in his mind the way one turns over a stone to see what lives beneath it. He found it slightly less funny than he had a moment ago. Where is the contact now? Still decelerating, Admiral. Current position puts it at 40 minutes from engagement range. It has not altered course. Of course it had not altered course. Jareth looked at his 34 ships arranged in clean, overlapping defensive patterns across the system. He looked at the heat signature of the incoming vessel, still burning hard, the hull running at temperatures that no properly maintained ship should be running at, which meant whoever was flying it had made a considered decision to push the machinery past its limits. All ships, he said, full targeting lock on the contact. I want solution ready for coordinated engagement the moment it enters range. Admiral, do you want to wait for it to stand down? Jareth considered the message he had received, the calm voice, the 13-minute deadline, the single vessel flying toward 34 without hesitation. No, he said, I do not think it is going to stand down. He was not yet afraid. He was something adjacent to it, a sharpened attentiveness, a revision of his estimates. He had expected today to finish breaking a civilization. He had not expected company. The contact kept coming. Its hull temperature kept climbing. Somewhere inside that approaching vessel, something was being charged. His sensors could not identify the weapons system, because they had never seen it before in the Keth's entire naval history, and the Keth had a very long naval history. Jareth stood very straight and watched it come. He told himself he was not concerned. He was very nearly convincing. I had 19 days to think about what I was going to say when we got there, and I still had not decided. My name is Yusra Akafar. I am a commander in the United Human Stellar Navy, and I am currently in serious trouble with my government. I made that choice with both eyes open, and I would make it again. And if the court-martial actually goes forward, I will say so directly to whoever is sitting across the table from me. Let me tell you about Directive 7. It is buried in Section 41 of the Human Stellar Navy Charter, which most people have never read, and which most Navy officers know about the way you know about an emergency exit, useful to understand, hopefully never needed. It was written after an incident 60 years ago that the Navy does not discuss publicly, in which an assembly non-intervention ruling allowed a situation to progress past the point where anything could be done about it. The officers who survived that mission came home and argued, loudly and persistently, for a mechanism that would allow a commander on the ground to act when the committee room had failed. It took 11 years to get it approved. The compromise was significant. The commander who invokes it faces automatic review, mandatory court proceeding, and potential discharge. It is not a free pass. It is a door that opens only in the worst circumstances, with the full understanding that walking through it has a cost. The assembly voted on Korathi Prime on day 3 of the Keth siege. I watched the result come through and sat with my navigation officer, a young man named George Allen, who was 26 years old and had been in the Navy for 4 years, and looked at me with the specific expression of someone waiting for an adult to tell him what to do. I invoked Directive 7 40 minutes after the vote result cleared. The Relentless Consequence is not a typical vessel. She was built under a program that the Navy calls, with characteristic understatement, the Heavy Response Initiative. The program was conceived in response to a strategic assessment that found a consistent pattern in galactic conflicts. Species that had never fought each other had no practical doctrine for asymmetric engagements. They built fleets designed to fight other fleets of similar scale. They did not, in the main, have detailed answers to the question of what one ship could do against many. Humanity had answers to that question. We had been working on them for thousands of years. We had fought wars on oceans with single vessels against squadrons, wars in the air with outnumbered pilots against overwhelming formations, wars in the dark of space itself where one crew had to outthink a dozen opponents because outgunning them was not possible. We lost those engagements often. We won them sometimes. And every time, we learned something, and we wrote it down, and we tried to build it into the next generation of ships and people. The Relentless Consequence was the current answer. She was 1,200 meters of reconsidered assumptions, ablative cascade armor that absorbed rather than deflected directed energy, a drive system borrowed from a physics paper that the Navy had classified for 6 years before anyone admitted it worked, and a weapons layout designed not to destroy but to disable, because a disabled ship stops shooting and a destroyed ship's debris becomes a navigational problem. She was also currently running at 114% of rated drive output, which I had authorized on day 1 and had not walked back, because every day slower was another day of the Keth siege, and I had done the math and decided the machinery could hold. It held 19 days. I will not pretend it was comfortable. The Relentless Consequence was not a comfortable ship under any circumstances, and under emergency drive conditions she was loud, hot, and vibrating at a frequency that settled into your bones after about 72 hours and did not leave. My crew of 211 people rotated through their stations, slept when they could, ate when they remembered to, and did not complain in my hearing, which I appreciated enormously. George Allen ran navigation and kept the course corrections coming with a steadiness that I found, in the quietest hours, genuinely moving. My weapons officer, a woman named Paula Crane, ran efficiency drills every 8 hours, not because I ordered them but because she had looked at the tactical situation ahead and decided that the crew should be at their absolute best when we arrived. My chief engineer, an older man named Dan Frost, came to me on day 12 and said the port engine housing was showing microfractures consistent with sustained overload, and asked what I wanted to do about it. I told him to monitor it and keep us moving. He looked at me, the way engineers look at commanders who have made a decision they disagree with but understand. "Yes, Commander," he said, and went back below. We composed the warning message on day 17. I drafted it myself and then let George look at it, because George had a better instinct for tone than I did. He read it and made one small change. He removed a sentence that he felt sounded like we were uncertain. He was right. The message needed to sound like what it was, a statement of fact from someone who had already decided. 13 minutes. I chose 13 because it was enough time to begin a real withdrawal and not enough time to think too carefully about whether you wanted to. We sent it when we had 40 minutes to engagement range. I watched the Keth fleet's targeting systems light up on Paula's board, all 34 ships, every single one of them painting us simultaneously. It was an almost beautiful pattern in the tactical display, like a constellation rearranging itself to point at the same star. "They're not moving," George said. "I know." "Commander," Paula turned from her weapon station. She was calm. She was always calm. I had recruited her specifically because she was the calmest person I had ever met in a uniform. "They are going to fire." "I know." "All of them." "I know, Paula." She nodded once and turned back to her board. The 13 minutes passed. They did not begin withdrawal. I had not expected them to. The Keth did not negotiate under pressure. It was not in their doctrine or their character. They would fight, and when they found that fighting did not work, they would reassess. That was the theory. I had built the entire mission on it. "Brace," I said. It hit us like a wall. 34 ships firing in coordinated sequence produces a level of incoming fire that I cannot describe adequately in ordinary language. The relentless consequence shuddered from her bow to her drives. The ablative cascade armor did what it was designed to do. It absorbed the first wave, shed the second, and managed the third with damage that was significant but not catastrophic. The lights went red. The collision alarms were screaming. Dan's voice came through the internal channel reporting compartment integrity across the ship, in a flat, continuous stream that I listened to the way you listen to weather, not for the individual words, but for the overall pattern, for the note that would tell me something had gone wrong in a way that could not be managed. The pattern held. We were damaged, we were not broken. "Paula," I said. "Ready," she said. "Target their power junctions first, then drive cores on the outer ships. I want them crippled, and I want them crippled in a pattern that breaks their formation geometry. If we can get them shooting at each other's blind spots, we take some of the pressure off ourselves." Understood. What followed is difficult to describe from the inside, because from the inside it was noise and light and heat, and numbers and voices in my ear and decisions made in fragments of seconds. I will try to give you the shape of it. The relentless consequence was not built to stand still and trade fire with superior numbers. She was built to move. George kept us moving, cutting angles, using the mass of disabled Keth ships as shields, threading the spaces between them in maneuvers that required him to fly a 1,200-meter vessel through gaps that were not designed to be threaded. There was a moment, approximately 11 minutes into the engagement, where we passed within 300 meters of a Keth destroyer that was trying to come around for a flanking shot, and I watched its hull slide past our viewport close enough that I could see the individual plating sections. George did not blink. Paula's strikes were surgical. She was not trying to destroy those ships. She was trying to make them stop, and she was succeeding, because she had studied Keth naval architecture for the entire 19-day journey, and she knew exactly which systems to hit to produce maximum incapacitation at minimum expenditure. 6 ships fully disabled in the first 90 seconds, 3 more in the next 60. The coordinated targeting pattern began to break. as the fleet tried to compensate for losing nearly a third of their active units faster than their formation doctrine anticipated. I kept broadcasting on all frequencies, not to the Keth command, to the Korathi. "Ambassador," I said, "we are here, hold on, we are here." I do not know if they heard it in time. I know they heard it eventually. Then the port engine housing gave way. Dan's voice in my ear, "Commander, catastrophic fracture, port drive at 0, significant damage to adjacent systems. We have a breach risk in compartment 7. 1 dead." Her name was Lieutenant Carol Webb. She was 31 years old. She was in compartment 7 doing a routine integrity check when the housing failed. She did not have time to reach a safe zone. I learned this 20 seconds after it happened, in the middle of an ongoing engagement, and I filed it in the part of my mind that keeps the things you deal with after, and I gripped the armrest of my command chair hard enough that my knuckles ached. "Seal compartment 7, I said. "Damage control to port drive. George, compensate on thrust and give me a new firing angle. Paula, keep going." They kept going. We were down to 1 functional drive. The Keth fleet was down to 19 capable ships. The math was still against us, but the math was moving. I looked at the tactical display. I looked at the planet below, visible through the viewport when our angle brought it into view, gray and scarred, and still lit by fires that the siege had started. "Keep going," I said again, to no one in particular. We kept going. The sky above Korathi Prime had become something that my people had no word for. I am Velthara. I have spent my career in diplomacy. I believe in language, in the precise, careful use of words to build things that violence cannot. And I am telling you that standing in the ruins of our command bunker, looking up through the cracked transparency of our emergency dome at the light show of an orbital battle, I had no words. OVAs had managed to patch our external sensors into a working display. It was a partial picture. Our systems were too damaged for full resolution, but it was enough to see the shape of what was happening above us. 1 ship against 34. And the 1 ship was not dying. I watched it move. I watched it cut through the Keth formation at angles that seemed to defy what I knew about mass and momentum, though what I actually knew about naval combat was limited to what I had read in historical records, and those records, I was now understanding, had not prepared me for this. The human ship was not trying to hold a position. It was moving constantly, and every movement seemed to pull the Keth response slightly out of alignment. I saw the drive signatures of Keth ships going cold 1, then 3, then 2 more, and understood that the human vessel was not destroying them. It was removing them from the fight. There is a difference. I did not fully understand the difference at the time. I have thought about it since. To destroy a ship is to say, you end here. To disable it is to say, you are not worth killing. You are only worth stopping. It is a more confident statement in a way. It requires the certainty that you do not need to destroy your enemy only to make them irrelevant. That was what the relentless consequence was doing to the Keth fleet. OVAS was trying to raise the human ship on our comm unit. The channel was crowded with Keth military traffic, urgent, clipped transmissions that I could not understand because the Keth language is structured around a phonology my vocal apparatus cannot produce. But even without understanding the words, I could hear the quality of those transmissions change. In the first 20 minutes of the battle, the Keth communications had the rhythm of coordinated command, orderly, sequential. By the 30-minute mark, that rhythm was fracturing. People were interrupting each other. There were pauses that should not have existed. There was, underneath the alien phonology, something that I recognized because it has no species. It has no species at all. They were not ready for this. I watched the display. I watched the human ship take hit after hit and keep moving. I watched the Keth formation try to adjust and lose another ship and try to adjust again. I watched the tactical geometry of the battle change in a way that should not have been possible. that violated every recorded precedent for what one vessel could accomplish against 34. Then Ovas said, "Ambassador, I have a direct channel, the human ship. They're asking for you specifically." I took the comm unit from him. My hands were steadier than I expected. "This is Ambassador Velthara of the Korathi Conclave." There was a pause, a very brief one. The battle was still happening above us, and then a voice said, "Ambassador, we are sorry it took us this long, hold a little longer." A human voice, female, exhausted in a way that sat just beneath the surface of her words, visible only to someone listening for it. I knew that kind of exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of someone who has been making hard decisions for a very long time without rest. "Why did you come?" I asked. It was not what a diplomat would say. It was what I actually wanted to know. "Your government abstained. The assembly gave you a reason to stay away. Why did you come?" Another pause. I could hear background noise on the channel, alarms, voices, the ship around her. She said, "Abstaining means we did not vote yes. It does not mean we stayed home." I held the comm unit and said nothing for a moment. "There is a court-martial waiting for me," she continued, as if this were a minor administrative note. "I invoked a provision that allows a commander to act when the system has failed. I invoked it before the vote finished, because I did the math and understood that if I waited for official authorization, there would not be anything left to authorize action for." I thought about Caleb Ford, the human representative, shaking my hand and saying, "An abstention is not the same as a no." I thought about the 19 days it had taken this ship to reach us, which meant it had begun moving before the assembly even completed its deliberation. "You planned for failure," I said. "We planned for the possibility of failure," she said. "We hoped we were wrong. We were not." On my display, 3 more Keth ships lost power. The fleet's formation had completely collapsed. Ground commanders were requesting authorization to withdraw. I could see the pattern of movement beginning even through our damaged sensors, armored units pulling back from the outer districts, aircraft reversing course. "Commander," I said, "what is your name?" "Akefir," she said, "Yusra Akefir." "Commander Akefir," I said, "the ground forces are pulling back." "I see it," she said. There was something in her voice then that I cannot name precisely. Not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated. Relief without celebration. The feeling of having done a thing that needed doing and being glad it is done and not glad about anything else surrounding it. "We have casualties," she said. Then, "You should know that. We have people who did not make it." "I know," I said, though I did not know the specifics. "I am sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just hold the line a little longer. We need to make sure the withdrawal is complete before we ease pressure." I looked at Ovas. He was staring at the display with an expression I recognized as belonging to someone who has been living inside a hopeless situation and has just encountered evidence that it may not, in fact, be hopeless. It is a fragile look. It requires careful handling. "We will hold," I said. I watched Fleet Admiral Jareth's flagship begin to move. It moved slowly at first. The Vorath's edge was enormous and the withdrawal was not a flight. It was deliberate, organized. The withdrawal of a force that was choosing to leave rather than being rooted, which I understood was important to them. The Keth would not run. They would reassess and depart on their own terms, and the distinction mattered to their sense of themselves. I did not care about their sense of themselves. I cared about the fact that they were leaving. The ground forces cleared our outer districts within 2 hours. The orbital fleet made its final adjustments and began the transit out of the system over the following 6 hours. Jareth sent no further communications to us directly. He sent a brief transmission to the Relentless Consequence, a single sentence that Verath translated for him later, and he committed to his personal record, where it stayed. The sentence was, "We will not forget this." It was not a threat exactly, or it was a threat, but it was also something else, an acknowledgement. Jareth was not the kind of being who forgot. He would record this engagement with full accuracy and file it with the Dominion's intelligence archive. Other Keth admirals would read it. Other Keth strategists would study it. Good, that was in some ways the point. I will tell you what the relentless consequence looked like when I finally boarded her. 3 weeks after the Keth withdrawal, when she had settled into a stable orbit and the most urgent repairs had been completed, Commander extended an invitation for a formal visit. I had been asking to come since the day the fleet left. I wanted to see it. I needed to see it. The shuttle ride-up was quiet. Ovas came with me and 2 members of my remaining staff, and we said very little on the way. The planet below us was in ways that would take generations to fully repair, but it was there. It was still there. The docking bay of the relentless consequence was enormous and smelled of hot metal and sealant, and something chemical that I could not identify. The ship's chief engineer, a man named Dan Frost, met us at the airlock, a wide, weathered man with the kind of face that has seen a great deal and decided not to make a performance of it. "Ambassador," he said, "watch your step. We've had to reroute some of the corridor systems." Watch your step. I had survived 97 hours of siege in a bunker, and the first thing someone said to me on the ship that had saved us was watch your step. I found this deeply, genuinely comforting. Dan led us through corridors that told the story of the battle in their walls. There were sections where the plating had been replaced with emergency sheet metal of a slightly different color, creating a patchwork that made the ship look like something that had been carefully and urgently repaired rather than something that had never been damaged, which was exactly what it was. There were sealed sections where the repair crews were still working. There were cable bundles rerouted along the floors with yellow safety markings. There was a section of hull where the original plating had been cut away entirely and replaced with something new, and someone had welded a flag patch, the small ceremonial version, the kind worn on a uniform directly over the join. I stopped when I saw that. "Who did this?" I asked. Dan looked at it. "George," he said, "navigation officer." He said it seemed right. I stood there for a moment. I am a diplomat. I have given speeches in 11 languages. I could not immediately find words. "It does seem right," I said. We continued. The damage was significant. I will not minimize it. One section of the port drive housing was still being rebuilt, and Dan explained that it had failed during the engagement itself, which was how they had lost Lieutenant Carroll. He said her name plainly and without decoration, and I appreciated that. She had been 31 years old. She had been doing her job in the wrong place when the wrong thing happened, and she was gone, and no amount of diplomatic language was going to make that into something it was not. I asked Dan to show me where the flag patch was in relation to where she had been. He understood why I was asking. He showed me. I stood there for a moment alone. Ovas waited at a respectful distance. Then I nodded and we moved on. Commander was in what she called the secondary briefing room, which was a small, practical space with a table and chairs, and a display screen that was currently showing a navigation chart of the system. She stood when I came in, which I had not expected, and she was shorter than I had pictured from her voice, compact and precise, with the look of someone who had not slept properly in several weeks and had stopped waiting for the opportunity to do so. I had prepared something to say. Formal gratitude, diplomatic phrasing, the kind of language that carries appropriate weight in official contexts. I looked at her and said, "Thank you." She nodded once. "Sit down, Ambassador, please." We sat. One of her crew brought something hot to drink, a human preparation that I had encountered before and found unexpectedly pleasant. She had a court-martial waiting. She had told me this over the comm, and I had spent the 3 weeks since trying to understand what that meant in practical terms. I asked her directly. "It means," she said, That I go before a review board and explain what I did and why I did it. Directive 7 is legal. The review process is also legal. Both things are true at the same time. And if they rule against you, then they rule against me. She said it with an equanimity that I found almost unsettling, not because it was cold, but because it was genuine. She had made her calculation before she lit the drive. She had known the math. She had done it anyway. I knew what I was doing when I invoked it. I did not do it expecting to avoid consequences. I did it because the alternative was standing still while something terrible happened, and I could not do that. I thought about the Galactic Assembly. I thought about the procedural delays and the agenda disagreements and the carefully worded expression of deep concern. I thought about the 15 days between our first distress signal and the moment a ship appeared in our sky. The Assembly is furious, I told her. It was true. I had received communications from 3 different member species diplomatic offices expressing formal concern about the precedent that Directive 7's invocation set. The collective had used the word reckless. They had questioned whether Human Naval Command could be considered a reliable partner for future cooperation. I know, said. The said nothing. She looked at me, nothing at all. Officially. But 2 weeks ago, their foreign ministry submitted a formal inquiry to the Human Stellar Navy's Diplomatic Liaison Office, asking about the terms of your mutual defense framework. Something moved across her face, not surprise, something closer to grim satisfaction. They have been watching thee for a century, she said. They know what it looks like when someone actually stops them. Yes, I said. The political landscape in the weeks since the withdrawal had been complex in ways I was still mapping. The collective's anger was real but carefully measured. They had business relationships with thee, and could not be seen to celebrate their fleet's retreat, but they were also not entirely displeased that someone else had handled a problem they were too economically entangled to address. They had issued their protest, and then gone quiet in a way that suggested internal disagreement. And the informal approach to the Human Diplomatic Office was, in my estimation, the most significant thing that had happened in interstellar politics in the past decade. Not the battle, not even the outcome. The fact that one species had watched and decided quietly that this was the kind of friend worth having. I asked the question I had been holding since the bunker. The real question, underneath all the diplomacy. You are younger than I expected, I said. You have a court-martial ahead and a ship that nearly did not survive and one of your people did not come home, and you are already looking at navigation charts. I nodded toward the display. Where are you going next? She was quiet for a moment. There are 14 active conflicts in the Assembly's review queue, she said. 14 situations that have passed the 72-hour documentation threshold for Directive 7 consideration. Most of them will resolve before intervention becomes necessary. Some will not. She paused. The court-martial result will determine whether I am available for the ones that do not. And if it goes in your favor. She looked at the navigation chart. Then I have work to do, she said. I thought about what she was. I thought about what humanity was in the context of a galaxy that had largely moved past the need for what she represented. The other species of the Assembly had evolved away from their conflicts, slowly and deliberately over centuries, or they had built consensus into their systems, deliberation into their institutions, careful caution into the architecture of how they made decisions. They were in many ways more sophisticated than humans, more measured, more patient. And they had watched the absorb civilization after civilization for 400 years without being able to stop it, because stopping it required a willingness to move first, move fast, and accept the consequences of acting without complete consensus. Humanity had never stopped being willing to do that. I asked her directly, do you think that is a flaw, the fact that your species never moved past this kind of readiness? She considered the question seriously. She was that kind of person. She did not deflect difficult questions or offer comfortable answers. Every species in the assembly evolved out of something, she said. They evolved out of a predatory social structure. They evolved out of a period of extreme resource conflict. They grew past those things over thousands of years. And that growth is real and it matters. She held the cup in both hands. We evolved past a lot of things too. We stopped a lot of wars that we would have fought 1,000 years ago. We built institutions, we made agreements, we learned. She paused. But we did not unlearn how to fight. And I am not sure the galaxy is actually better served by a species that has. Some would say violence is never the answer. Some would say that, she agreed. And in most cases they are right. But in the cases where they are wrong, in the cases where something is actively happening, and the only thing that stops it is someone willing to get between it and the people it is happening to, the cost of being wrong is paid by people who are not in the room when the philosophy is discussed. The Korathi who had not reached the bunkers, the outer dome districts, the processing facilities that had been struck first. I set my cup down. The Assembly is going to push for restrictions on Directive 7, I said. There will be a review process. They will want to add approval requirements, additional oversight, longer timelines. I know. They may succeed. They may, she said. And if they do, the next time something like this happens, whoever invokes it will face those additional barriers. She did not seem particularly upset by this. The system works through friction. It works through the tension between acting and waiting. I put weight on the acting side. Other people will put weight on the waiting side. Eventually, the thing that comes out of that process is something none of us designed on purpose, but that reflects a real argument about real values. And in the meantime, there are 14 files in the queue. Her court-martial, as it happened, was resolved in her favor 5 weeks later. The review board found that Directive 7 had been properly invoked under its existing terms. The Korathi situation had met every documented threshold. The Assembly's failure to act had been clear and on record, and Akafar had filed the correct paperwork with the correct timing. The Navy's legal office ruled that the intervention, being successful, could not be retroactively invalidated under the Charter's existing language. She received a commendation. I learned later, through channels, that she had framed it and turned it face down on her desk. I do not know if that is true. It sounds like her. She was back on active duty within 6 weeks of the court-martial resolution. The relentless consequence had been repaired, new port engine housing, new plating on the damaged sections, new crew members to replace the ones lost and the ones reassigned during the review period. George Allen was still at navigation. Paula Crane was still at weapons. Dan Frost was still below, watching the machinery. The Korathi flag patch stayed on the hull. No one removed it, and Akafar did not order it removed, and so it stayed. I do not know if she circled those 14 files in red. I heard this from someone who heard it from someone, the kind of information that travels the way important things travel, sideways, quietly, person to person, without official documentation. I am a diplomat. I know how much of the real world moves in exactly that fashion. I know that 3 of those 14 situations resolved diplomatically within the period I was tracking. I know that 2 others escalated, and that the Assembly acted on them slowly, with the machinery of consensus grinding forward the way it does. I know that 2 more remain unresolved as of my last information. I know where the relentless consequence is currently assigned. I spent 40 years believing that the institutions were enough, that if you built the right frameworks, maintained the right relationships, filed the right reports in the right language, the system would hold. I still believe in the work of diplomacy. I still believe in the value of conversation over confrontation, of patience over speed, of consensus over unilateral action in the vast majority of circumstances. But I also believe this. The system is made of people, And sometimes the people in the system fail, and the gap between the failure and the recovery is measured in lives. Someone has to be willing to stand in that gap. I used to think humanity abstained from our vote because they were cautious, because they were young and uncertain, and still finding their place among older, more careful civilizations. I thought the abstention meant they were waiting to see how things developed before committing. I know better now. They abstained because when the vote failed, when we failed ourselves, they wanted their hands free. On Korathi Prime, in the outer districts where the Keth siege had done its worst work, there is a memorial wall going up. It is made from stone quarried at the same site as the original diplomatic quarter, the same material as the bunker walls that held when everything else was falling. The names will be inscribed there, the Korathi who did not survive. There will also be one human name. Lieutenant Carol Webb, 31 years old. She was in the wrong place at the wrong moment doing her job on a ship that had no business being there and came anyway. I visited the construction site before I left for Varath Station to attend what will almost certainly be a very unpleasant assembly session. I stood in front of the incomplete wall in the early morning, when the air was cold and still, and the sky above Korathi Prime was, for the first time in weeks, clear. I thought about a ship burning toward us in the dark. I thought about a voice on an open channel, calm and unhurried, delivering a 13-minute warning to 34 warships. I thought about a flag patch welded over a scar in a hull. And then I went back to work. Because that is what you do. You hold a little longer and then you go back to work, and you hope that the next time something comes howling out of the void, it is on your side again. So far it has been.